You have Mary Meyer. Do you know that her husband's been in the hospital?
That's an obstacle course. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Kate Clark. I'm the director of the Mercer County Historical Society. For those of you joining us live, welcome. We're so glad that you are joining us live on Facebook. Today, we're going to be enjoying a talk from Ms. Karen Bennett. She has presented with us before to great success. So, without further ado, I will turn things over to her and we'll get started.
Thank you. It's glad to be back, and I hope you enjoy hearing about the early Mercer County churches. Mercer County was created in 1820 and organized in 1824. And soon after, the settlers started arriving. They came from other parts of Ohio. Of course, we were on the western frontier then, so they came from the eastern states like Pennsylvania, New York, Virginia, Kentucky, but others came from much farther away, from Germany, lots from Germany. And the main draw for these people was the availability of good, cheap farmland. Now, farmland was about $1.25 an acre at that time. So, but I don't know if you would call it good at that time because there was a lot of forest and a lot of it was swampy land too. So they really had their work cut out for them to cut down all the trees. Cleared the forest, they built the cabins before they could even work the fields. But despite all that, they welcomed family and friends to this new area with lots of opportunity. So their faith was also very important to them, so they found ways to worship. And the early worshipers followed pretty much the same pattern no matter what the denomination. They started worshiping in their homes at first, sometimes in barns, sometimes in schools, sometimes even under the canopy of a tree, a meeting house, anywhere they could have a worship service. Then they usually built a log church. And then, as their congregations expanded, they built a frame church, and sometimes later, a brick church. Of course, there was a shortage of ministers, too, so they relied on circuit riders, traveling ministers, and they traveled miles to minister to these scattered congregations. Now, I found this interesting emblem on a tombstone over at Swamp College. It's Merritt Potts, and it's a United Methodist minister, and it looks an awful lot like that picture. I thought that was pretty interesting. So to give you an idea about what the traveling minister's life was like, there was the traveling minister at St. Paul Lutheran over in Liberty Township, which was founded in 1841. He traveled from Zion Friedheim, which is north of Decatur. That would be between Decatur and 14. Over 25 miles he traveled into Mercer County. And I have excerpts from a couple letters written by this St. Paul Lutheran's traveling ministers. So this is Reverend Nape, and he was the one at Zion Friedheim. He wrote this in about 1838. I have 8 other places where I preach. The most distant is about 32 American miles. Of course, he was a German Lutheran preacher. Every 4 weeks I get around. I preach during the week at most of the places. On the second Sunday, I always preach at the church where I live. I do not have a definite salary, but it will improve with time. There are still few churches. We preach in the homes here and there, and frequently even in a barn. Now, their second minister over there wrote this in 1847. One has to be away from home so often, and no congregation is served as it should be. Then there are the awful roads. Recently, I sank in the prairie with my horse up to its body. I can only preach every 3 to 6 weeks. My clothes are tattered, and yet I cannot allow myself to buy new ones because I do not want to be stuck in debt. So those are pretty interesting insights into what they had to put up with. So here's a little map of Mercer County and the 14 townships, and I'm predominantly going to talk about the rural churches, the early rural churches, and I'm also going to talk about Mercer County as we know it today. Now, I know it was bigger back before 1848, but we're going to talk about the way we know Mercer County today. So the earliest churches in Mercer County were organized in the 1830s. Some of the churches are still active, some have merged with other churches, and some have just totally disbanded. Then there are a number of denominations in Mercer County, but the southern half of the county has a large Catholic presence. There are 20 Catholic churches in the whole county, and there's one Catholic church in northern Mercer County. So that gives you an idea where they're located. Probably the reason for that is that the Miami Erie Canal. It played a big role in the German immigrants traveling to this area because it made travel so much easier. And there was already a settlement at Stallowstown, which is Minster, and a little bit south of there. So the Germans were getting off probably at Minster and just coming a little bit to the west, and they ended up in southern Mercer County. So in this kind of a 4-county area that I'm going to talk about briefly, is you have your Auglaize, Shelby, Dark, and Mercer. In that 4-county area, by 1900, it was a large German Catholic community, and it contained more than 40 parishes, 6 convents, plus churches, schools, rectories, a seminary, and cemeteries. Their life was centered on agriculture and the strong European Catholic heritage. So the area is so unique that they have their own nickname, and a 45-mile scenic byway that's on the National Register of Historic Places is called the Land of the Cross-Tipped Churches State Scenic Byway. The byway consists of more than 50 billion buildings in southern Mercer and Auglaize County, northern Dark and Shelby, and one in Indiana, and they represent the German Catholic settlement in that area. 20 of the 34 sites along the byway are in Mercer County, and 18 of them are churches. So as you travel through on this byway, you see all these beautiful spires with the cross tips, very well named. So I will go over these churches briefly on this picture here. Left to right, going counterclockwise, is St. Aloysius. It was organized in 1836. That's when it's organized, not the building built. St. Francis is below it, 1858. St. Gwendolyn, 1856. St. Bernard's, 1874. St. Joseph at Fort Recovery, 1839. And Trinity at Coldwater. So many of the churches along this byway, and in southern Mercer County, are in Marion Township, but not all. So we're going to look at some of the earliest Catholic churches along the way. And I'm just going to explain my slides a little bit. I probably won't give all these dates every time, but the date behind the church name is the date the church was organized. And if there's nothing behind the dash, it means they're still active. And if there's a date behind it, that's when the church disbanded. And so as I said, the organization is different than the building. So then lots of times I will put when the church was built. This one happened to be built in 1891. So this is St. John the Baptist. It is on 119 in St. John in Marion Township. It was settled by immigrants from Oldenburg. This was their second brick building, built in 1891, and unfortunately this is the one that burned last year, caught fire, and I think they maybe were going to restore it, but then the bad wind came down in December and it tore the west wall down, so they had to raise the whole building. It was a beautiful church, but that was the one that was destroyed by that fire. St. Mary's Church is on Philothea Road in Butler Township. And it's one of the very first churches in Butler Township. It may be the oldest existing church building in the county. I have not seen any earlier that's still surviving in 1871. So this, if anybody knows, I would be happy to know, but this may be the oldest. It's gone through several renovations, but it's a beautiful building. This parish was known for their work and their help with Mercer County's black community back in the 1800s. And they had a number of black members of their church at that time. St. Henry Catholic Church is in St. Henry in Granville Township. This was their second brick church built in 1897. I think a lot of the Catholic churches maybe skipped the frame church building phase. I think they kind of went maybe from directly to the brick building. St. Joseph, sometimes known as St. Joe, is on St. Joe and Sawmill Roads, northeast of Montgomery in Covered Township. This is the second brick building that they built. It was settled by German immigrants from Baden. This community was called Victoria when it had a post office. And there were 4 daughter parishes from this church: St. Anthony, St. Gwendolyn, St. Henry, and Our Lady of Help of Christians in Fort Recovery. St. Rose Catholic Church is on 119 in St. Rose in Marion Township. And so here you can see, I luckily have photos of both of their brick churches they built. And the 1912 church is currently the church that they use. Nativity of the Blessed Virgin Mary, it's on 119 in Casella in Marion Township. Their first brick church was built in 1858, and they built the second brick church in 1888, but within months the whole church burned down, so they rebuilt the church in 1889, and that's the church we see today. But the Catholics did not establish the first churches in Mercer County. We'll probably give that award to the Methodists. So there was already a Methodist mission over in St. Mary's in about 1829, and St. Mary's is pretty close to Union Township, so they were starting some classes over in Union Township about 1831. And the little blue arrows with the red, the blue are churches that are still active. So we're up in Union Township, which is in the northeast corner of the county. Hamilton Bethel was established in 1831, and it's for sure the first church in Union Township, and probably the first church in Mercer County, or one of the first for sure. And you can see it's on that 1876 map and the newer map. They built the frame building in 1903, and that was their third church building that they built, and that's the one they're using today. And a couple years later, on the north end, right at the county line on Union Township, on Van Wert County Line Road and Tomlinson Road, they built Tomlinson Church. This church was known as the Church of the Four Johns at first: Tomlinson, Ross, Bevington, and Heath, but it's better known as Tomlinson. So in 1889, they built a brick church, and then they changed the name of the church to Wesley Chapel. And then in 1912, they built the church that they used until they disbanded. So we were up there about 2004. Of course, the church had been abandoned for years, and we got back in about 2014. So I'm not sure if it was just crumbling or if somebody was actively taking it down, but I'm sure it's not there anymore. So other early Methodist churches were being started around the county about 1838. It's Shanesville, the Rockford Methodist, Salina, and Salina Presbyterian. Now Joyce had this picture of this log church in some of her books, and she said it was built about 1840. She thought by the Presbyterians, but she said that the Methodists and the Presbyterians shared this church on the corner of Fayette and Ash Street. Now, before we leave Union Township, down in the corner on Denny Road and the county line, Always County, there was a Society of Friends Church, Quakers. There was a number of those in Mercer County over the years, called Charity Union. And when they disbanded in 1987, they moved the church over to a church camp. Yeah. Now I'm not sure the name of the church. It's on Barbara Werner Road in Always County. So if you want to go see that old church built in 1890, it's on the church camp over there in Always County. So now we're going to move over to the northwest part of the county, Black Creek, which is near and dear to me. I grew up in Black Creek Township. for Black Creek. There's no active churches, there's no villages, it's just good old Mercer County farmland in Black Creek Township. And there's two reservations up in over on the east side by Dublin Township. But there were once 6 churches in the township. So kind of in the center of the township, there was Duck Creek, you see over to the left, and there was Fountain Chapel kind of to the right. So Duck Creek is on State Route 49, about 3 miles north of Chat. And late in the evening on March 28th, 1920, just after dark, the church was completely blown apart by a cyclone. It destroyed the church totally, it knocked over some tombstones and even broke some tombstones. The church bell came straight down and it was not damaged, so they took it over into Indiana about 4 miles and they used it over at Hope Church. And most of the members then just went to the Chattanooga Methodist Church. They never rebuilt. Now the other Methodist church in Black Creek Township was Fountain Chapel, and it was on the corner of Pretty and the Rassisterman Road. Their cemetery is still there, and the church was across the road from the cemetery. And it's said that this church was built by a natural spring. Now, in the south you'll see East Bethel, which is on 707 east of 49. It was a UB church. They wanted to name this church Mount Pleasant or Bethel, Pleasant Bethel, but there were 7 other churches in the area with the name Pleasant, so they thought it would be too confusing. And as my talk goes on, you will see how popular the name Pleasant was for churches. So this was organized by Reverend Gillen, who organized the Montezuma UB Church in 1845, about 10 years before. And when the church closed in 1963, all the church members that were left were all descendants of the original church members. This church is no longer standing. So now in the middle of the township, and you can see we once, at one time, did have a post office for a short time at Black Creek Township. But there was Centenary Church. It was a UB church. It was on Manley Road. And it was by a natural spring also. Luttrell tells in his book, Luttrell was with the UB church and he wrote about these conferences they had. And the 29th August UB conference was held at Centenary Church. And he said they had a natural spring there at that church, which I thought was interesting. We already heard that Fountain Chapel had a natural spring, and now this one. And my dad, of course, I'm from Black Creek Township, always said that on the Miller Farm on Sike Road, there was a natural spring. So there must have been a lot of natural springs around Black Creek Township, which I found out pretty interesting. So in 1889, the United Brethren, UB, had a split over the constitutional issues. They split into 2 groups, the radicals, which were the conservatives, and they wanted to keep the old Constitution, and the liberals, who wanted to change the Constitution. And it appears that most in this area were radicals. But the liberals took out an injunction, took the people to court, and the courts favored the liberals. And so churches had to close, and people that were worshiping in these churches had to find some other place to worship. And it must have been a pretty nasty breakup. So Centenary was one of those churches. It had to close in 1891, and they used the church for a barn. So the worshipers there then had to go back to schoolhouses to worship. But that didn't hold them back. Pretty soon they built Fairview, just around the corner on Rockford West and Wabash Road. And they built that church in 1891, and they had a church again. That church closed in 1946, and they needed a church in Wilshire. So they cut the church in half and moved it to Wilshire on State Street, and it became Wilshire EUB. And it's still there. So if you're driving through Wilshire and you're on 33 and look off to the right, it's a home, I believe it's a residence, if it's even used today.
They renovated quite a bit, yes.
Yeah, but it's still there. So what a creative way to use a church. And the final church that was in Black Creek was another UB. It was a radical bill on Winkler Road, so some of them called it Winkler Church. And when the church closed, well, they had many renovations. You can see how they've added on to it. And it was used as a house for a while. And then when it was torn down, they erected the church bell there, and you can see Winkler School in the background. Now there's one more church that Mercer County tries to claim. They say that Black Creek had a seventh church. Well, and the history books say that, but I could never find it on a map. And so if you see that 1900 map of Black Creek Township, there's no church. But if you look on Van Wert County maps, and that little tiny wedge there, there's UB Church. And the history of the church says that it was on Abraham Pontius's farm, and there you can see Pontius's farm on that 1872 map. So that little line that's making a wedge is 33 going to Wilshire. And I know Mike Shue and I have tried to figure out where this church is, and I think I've got it figured out. So there's a cemetery right there at the end of Hill Road, and you can see the sign. That's the Mercer Van Wert County line, and I guess the cemetery is kind of is in both counties. And so this is looking toward Wilshire, and if you see that row of power lines, I'm pretty sure that's the county line. And so that would be your wedge there. And you can even see like a little driveway, and maybe the farmer uses that, or maybe that was the driveway for the church. But I'm pretty sure the churches over there are actually in Van Wert County. Mystery solved. So when that church disbanded in about 1918, I think it probably stayed there, the church, but they moved them. They needed a church in Rockford for the Nazarenes. They had been meeting in different meeting places in Rockford. So they moved that church, that one that we just talked about, that was in that little wedge. They moved it into Rockford for the Nazarenes to use. So they used it for a while, then the Baptists used it. This was on the corner of Franklin and Market. So the Baptists used it for several years, and then it was used as a gift shop and art studio. Ethel Ponsler, she painted angel pictures, and she called it Angel Studio. And then it was a Rising Star dance studio. And finally, the building was torn down about 2018, just a few years ago. But I find it so interesting where you find these churches were moved and how they use them. I enjoy tracking that down. So now we're in Dublin Township. We're going to talk a little bit about Dublin. And see, there's a couple active churches. We're going to go down to Otterbein or Stringtown Church there. And that is on, it's kind of in the middle with the blue there. It's on 707 east of 118. They built a log church in 1851. And in 1859, that UB conference we talked about before, they had the 7th conference there. And in 1869, they built a frame church, and the history says that they moved the log church into Hopewell Township a couple miles away. So I wanted to see where that was at. And so if you look on this 1876 map, it says UB Church. So that's where they moved the log church, and it would have been a couple miles away. So back at Stringtown, they had built this church. This is a picture like you had. They built the frame church in 1869. Well, then we run into this 1889 thing where the UB divided, and you get the radicals and the liberals. Well, the liberals had an injunction here too, and they prohibited the radicals from worshiping at their church. And so the radicals had to go down to what they called the Red School, which is across 118 down 707, about a mile or two to the west. So they worshiped there for a while. But they didn't let that stop them. They came back, and in 1896, they built a brick church. So here you have it. You can see the frame church in the background where the liberals are worshiping. You got the brick church over here where the radicals are worshiping. And then you have a cemetery in the middle. So the liberal group eventually dwindled down, and they kind of phased out, and their church closed, but the church stayed there vacant. So in 1930, the radicals were still there worshiping. Their church burnt to the ground, And so they moved the frame church over to the foundation to where the brick church was. And then they used that church, the old frame church. So this was a 1960 photo. They had done some renovation to the old frame church. This was that old frame church that they moved over. And they used that till 1967 when they built Otterbein. Now, Otterbein, Springtown, those names they used interchangeably. But I believe after this church was built, they used Otterbein more than they used the word Springtown, the name Springtown. So they built this limestone church in 1967 north of that old frame building. They tore down the frame building. So in 93, Otterbein merged with Calvary UB in Rockford, and they definitely named it Otterbein, and they met at this church. In 1999, this building was badly damaged by an arsonist, Jay Ballinger, who burned 23 rural churches in Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, and he was sentenced to 43 years in prison. Now, the foundation of the church, the basic structure was still okay, but the inside was badly burned. So Otterbein sold it to it was called Christian Church in 1999 for about $10,000. And the Christian Church was a non-denominational who had been meeting over in St. Mary's in different places, so they wanted their own church. So they actually fixed up all the, except for maybe electrical things like that, but they fixed up the interior of this church, and they used it for a few years. And meanwhile, the Otterbein and the Calvary group, it built a new church in 2000, New Horizons, on the south end of Rockford. So now we're going back to 707 Church, the one that was burned. So after the Christian Church left, sometime probably around 2008, 2009, St. Teresa Catholic Church, who had been in Rockford and had outgrown their church, renovated it, this church that had once been a UB church, and that's where they are worshiping now. And St. Teresa, this was their former church in Rockford that they had outgrown. Now this is just a little from Google, just that whole area we've been talking about. Over to the right is where that frame church first was. This is that Otterbein area on 707. And then over to the left, that big vast area, that's where the brick church was. Then they built this big limestone church in the back and the cemetery in the middle. Now again, in Luke Stroll's book, he had the sketch of this church. And he said the first ever conference of the UB All-Lakes Conference was held in Mercer County in Pleasant Hill, UB Church. Had trouble finding this, didn't know where it was at. So I looked for clues in the book. He said it was near the home of Abe Schimmeldecker. Well, that told me something. He was up north of Rockford. And finally looked on it, found it on the 1853 map where it says UB Meeting House in Dublin Township. It was in the fractured section 11, right on the edge of the Godfrey Reserve. And it on the 1876 map, it is gone. There was another church there, but if you're familiar with going out on 117 out of Rockford, there's kind of a lot of turns on that road. There's on 117, there's a cemetery on each side of the road. And there was a Mount Olive Church on the south side, and then on the north side, I believe that's where this church was. Because the south side would have been in the reserve, and the north side was in the fractured section. Mystery solved. Now, there was another Pleasant Hill in Rockford at a later date. And you get information anywhere you can. So this came from the obituary of Mrs. Philip Smith in 1933 in the Rockford paper. After marriage, she lived on a farm 1 mile south of Rockford. A French church was organized in 1888, meeting in a log cabin, and Mrs. Smith became a charter member. In 1889, a meeting house was erected on the Willard Tingley farm. You see Willard's name over there, named Pleasant Hill Friends Church. In 1906, the building was moved to Rockford and called the Rockford Friends Church. And she was a faithful member until her death. So a lot of information there. So yes, they moved that church that would have been on Now Road, moved it into Rockford, and Rockford Friends used it until 1942. Then Calvary UB used it until 1993. If you remember, Calvary was the one that joined with Springtown. Then after that, it became Victory Life Tabernacle for just a couple years. Then I think it was a residence for a while. But then the last I knew, and within very recent years, it was an Airbnb. So they really got a lot of use out of these spring churches. Now we're going to go to Liberty Township. Also, Liberty is right south of Black Creek, borders Indiana. And still a number of active churches, you can see with the blue arrows. St. Paul Lutheran Liberty Township. I mentioned this church earlier when I read the letters from the traveling minister. And this was definitely the first church in Liberty Township, and it's probably the first Lutheran congregation in Mercer County. And their first traveling minister was the one that came from between Decatur and Fort Wayne. And their next two ministers, they shared with Zion Lutheran at Shum, which Shum is just east of Wilshire, and they were a joint congregation when the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod was formed in 1847. So they were actually part of that Lutheran Church Missouri Synod for probably a couple of years until about 1849. But there were several early divisions in this church, and this was one of them. Zion Lutheran, this is the church we attended this all my life, in Chattanooga, and it was formed as an outgrowth of the one we just saw, St. Paul, in 1855. So our church skipped the log church phase, and we went directly to the frame church. And it is on south end of Chat, on the corner of 49 and Tama Road. And this frame building was used by the Lutherans and the Evangelicals for 7 years until the Evangelicals sold their interest and built a different church, and we'll talk about them next. And our church also had a little church school built in 1904 by an architect from Bern, Indiana, Abraham Bagley. And it was sold in 48 and used for a home near Decatur, Indiana. These people were really thrifty. They really wanted to use these, they didn't waste anything. I guess that's your German heritage for you. And then the parsonage, you can see in the back, and that burned during World War II, and I know that because among my dad's World War II letters, he mentioned that he was sorry to hear that the parsonage had burned, so that gives me a date when the parsonage burned. So in 1916, they built a brick church here. That's the one we use today, and you can see right on the corner a good perspective of where the churches were, side by side. This is what our church looks like today. They took the old frame church on the north end of Chat, and they used it for a barn there until about 1980, and they ended up tearing it down. But you can tell it was a church because you can see on that doorway there's like a little arch. So the other church that worshipped with our church until 1867 in that frame church, they were the Evangelicals, and they purchased some land a little to the east on Tama Road, and they ended up calling it the North Church because they built a South Church in 1886, and you can see that was on the corner of Wabash and Oregon. And they alternated Sundays. One Sunday would be north, one would be south. And that's what the South Church looked like. And then eventually in 1928, they just used the South Church exclusively, and the North Church became the parish hall. Little renovation there in 1941. And they had a lot of name changes. I'll mention those here in a second. Same church, but they kept changing names. So in 1965, they built a new church, and they tore the South Church down. They sold the parish hall to the Chattanooga Grange. The Grange used it for a while. They tore it down finally in 2018. So these name changes, they were first St. Paul Evangelical, then St. Paul's Evangelical Reformed, ENR, St. Paul's United Church of Christ, and then St. Paul's Country Church as we know them today. They're non-denominational. And most of these name changes were because different denominations merged together. They really weren't changing churches drastically, they were just putting names together. So now, looking at that map, that's Tamer Road going across there, clear to the right. I'm going to talk about another Friends Church, Liberty Chapel Friends. And it's just west of Township Line Road. The first frame church they had was struck by lightning and it burned. This was the second one. And this was the church where Mary Secar attended church. She was coming home from church June Day in 1872 when she was murdered. And she's buried in their church cemetery. So this church is no longer standing. I think it's gone about 2008. Chattanooga has another church, a United Methodist Church, much newer. This is the only church they've ever had since they were just established in 1910. Over on From Pike and Erastus Durbin in Liberty Township, there was a center chapel. They usually called it the Land Fair. It's across the road. There's a little tiny cemetery there, but Michelle Houtz, if you're familiar with her, she writes children's books. She restored a schoolhouse. It's right across the road. This was right across from the road where that schoolhouse is today. So they merged with a church over in Hopewell Township. It's on 118. It was Hope United Brethren. And they became what they called Land Fair. And then this Land Fair United Methodist. But last time I looked at their sign, I think they're just Land Fair Church. They dropped the Methodist off their church sign altogether. But that's another merger. So one church ends, but they merge in with another church. So since we're in Hopewell, right along 118, there's a lot of churches down 118 in Hopewell Township. Friends Chapel, I don't believe it's active anymore. It's at Tamer Road and 118. At one time, in 1942, there were four Friends churches in Mercer County. Friends Chapel, Liberty Chapel, Friends Home, which was near Salina, west of Salina, and Charity Union, and that would have been the one in Union Township. And one pastor served all four of those churches. So then at the top there, that's that little UB church that log church they moved in. This is 1876 map. You can see St. John Lutheran Church on down south. And this was their, they only had a log church and this church. This is their, would be their second church, their first brick one, built in 1881, and they have added on to that. And so they use the old church as a fellowship hall. And we talked about this Hope UB, which merged with Land Fair, and it's called Land Fair Church. Then there's Pleasant View Church of God at the end of that string of churches on 118, and I don't, they're no longer in existence, but I believe they have merged with Mount Carmel, which is in Liberty. So now over in Montezuma, you can see there's a UB church, and that was probably the second church formed in Franklin Township, and that was by that Reverend Gillen that founded the church over in Black Creek, that East Bethel. But the first church in Franklin Township was called a Disciples Church. And it was started out as a log church on William Long's property on Harrison and Clover Ford Roads. And by 1882, they had moved into Montezuma, and they were meeting different places. And by 1900, they had a church on the corner of Canal and Riley. And at some point, I'm not sure exactly, they became the Montezuma Church of Christ, and that's what they look like today. So you can see in the northern part of the county, there's a lot more movement than there was in the southern part of the county. So Our Lady of Guadalupe Catholic Church, in June of 1904, just a few months after their church was dedicated, it burned to the ground. And so to me, this looks like a picture of the church they're building, not the one that had burned. So they rebuilt it immediately in 1905, and that's what that looks like today. Now, going north out of Salina on 127, there were two churches, Church of God at Berry Bethel. It was on 127 in Howick. And then north even farther was 127 and Oregon Road, Copp's Chapel. And they had a neat little sign there. I don't think it's there anymore. The sign of Copp's Chapel, one of the original Methodist churches in Mercer County. The sign was there probably about 10 years ago. It was built in, it was a 1873. It was a 43 by 32 foot building. It was eventually purchased by Grover Newting and used for a barn. And go to a couple other townships. This was possibly the first church in Gibson Township. It was 2 miles south of Fort Recovery on Union City Road. Pisgah congregation, and it was a Presbyterian church. They built a church in 1883, but could not find it on the 1888 map, just a cemetery there. So if it was, it didn't last very long. And the Erastus United Methodist Church was on the, let's see, Bethel Corners of Washington Township. It was Erastus Urban in 219 east of Macedon. And it was called a Christian church in 1876 on the map, and then a Methodist on the 1888 map. And that church would have been built about 1884. So then we'll go to East Jefferson, and they had a West Old Town UB church. And I've seen it on earlier maps than this, but it was at Old Town and Riley Road. And they built, the church was built in 1870 and renovated in 1906. And in this 2004 photo, it was used as a carpentry business. But to make things even more complicated and confusing, there was an East Old Town Church. And it was the Fort Turkey and Old Town Road. I don't have any pictures of that. And, but they did, they relocated to Hillsdale United Brethren in St. Mary's in 1961. So, I hope you enjoyed learning about a few of the early Mercer County churches. Questions?
Within the first section you had about the United Brethren churches and it's split. One of them was called liberal and one was radical.
Radicals.
So in today's political parlance, liberal is liberal. Radical is even further out.
I know.
Conservative. How did that come about?
I don't know how they picked those names, but that's what they called them, the radicals and the liberals. But the radicals wanted to stay with the old Constitution. They said when they drafted the whole church, evidently the United Brethren Church was the first church that was actually formed in the United States. It wasn't brought over from Europe. It wasn't like a Catholic or Lutheran church. It was actually formed here. And when they wrote the Constitution, they made the Constitution so it would be unconstitutional to change it. And so it was very, very confusing. But when they split, yeah, that's what they called the radicals were the conservative group, and the liberals were the ones that wanted to change the Constitution, and the radicals wanted to keep it the way it was. And a little fun fact is that the head of the radicals was Milton Wright, the father of Orville and Wilbur. Oh, I thought that was pretty interesting. But it seems like most people around here were the radicals. They were the more old school. In fact, one man I talked to called it the old UB and the new UB. The old were the radicals, and but I don't know. I know what you're saying, and it is an odd choice of words. But that all kind of ended about they both used the UB name, but about 1946, the liberals became the Evangelical United Brethren, the EUBs, and so then that kind of with a little different name, they were kind of out of the picture. So if you see UB today, that's the radicals, because the EUBs joined with the Methodists about
68.
1968. Yes. So.
Nothing like church politics.
Oh, yeah. You think if you're in church you could get along.
Here, on the Lancaster Church, the reason there's no Lancaster, about 2 years ago, there was a break in the Methodist Church. I feel like this affiliation, and Lancaster was going on.
There's no church there now, and we don't see any,
And is that
I think is that Dibble Road?
west of Dibble Road,
When Dibble and
On the north side.
Stinger,
Okay.
on the north side of 703.
I'm not sure, but it's worth looking into now.
Street.
But I thought that was very confusing about the east and west of the
Right.
town. It's like, wow.
Okay.
And there was another church, if you follow 197 out, it's got several turns. Stager Road comes up from the south, and I think it's Holy Road, where 197 then turns east again. Used to be a church, it used to be called Goose Heaven. Finally it was torn down.
Nobody saw that.
I was
He's
sure
the
in
map
my
person.
travels, I would have seen it, but it's like so many other churches, 5 years and you forget.
I would have to look it up. Yeah. Because yes.
Oh, we have a question.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Someone asked, what about Beaver Chapel Congregational Christian Church?
Yeah. I don't have that. I would have to look up the information about that since I did not include it here. But
Okay.
yeah. Don't have it with me. Well,
You got a lot
was
of
there
comments.
anything specific? Because I did bring a little cheat sheet.
I was gonna say, I don't know, just asking about it in general, I think. I was gonna say, you got
Yeah, it was
plenty of people watching.
established, sometime between 1880 and 87. I have a question mark on that. It's on Karch Road. And I think it's still...
Still active.
Yeah, I think
Still there?
Still active. I think
Oh,
so.
still active.
Yes. I think so.
Okay.
Yeah. And
Very good.
Isn't that the church that they found the Bible recently? They discovered that old Bible?
Oh,
It's
at
in the
Beaver
paper.
at Beaver Chapel?
Yeah.
That's exciting. Okay. Well, there you go.
That was
Any other
Swamp
questions?
College. Wasn't it Swamp College they found the Bible?
Yeah, but that's where
That's a
Beaver
Beaver
Chapel.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay,
Swamp
sorry.
College, yeah. That's that same thing. Yeah.
Any other questions? All right. Well, I've got several comments on here. Some of them might have new information for you.
Okay, great.
So I will connect you with several comments on here, but if you don't have any more questions. All right. Thank you again so much.